The Beatles. The Beatles were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in 1960. With a lineup comprising John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, they are regarded as the most influential band of all time. The group were integral to the evolution of pop music into an art form and to the development of the counterculture of the 1960s. Their sound, rooted in skiffle, beat and 1950s rock and roll, incorporated elements of classical music and traditional pop in innovative ways. They also pioneered recording techniques and explored music styles ranging from ballads and Indian music to psychedelia and hard rock. As they continued to draw influences from a variety of cultural sources, their musical and lyrical sophistication grew, and they came to be seen as embodying the era's socio-cultural movements. Led by the band's primary songwriters, Lennon and McCartney, the Beatles built their reputation playing clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg over a 3-year period from 1960, initially with Stuart Sutcliffe playing bass. The core trio of Lennon, McCartney and Harrison, who had been together since 1958, went through a succession of drummers, including Pete Best, before asking Starr to join them in 1962. Manager Brian Epstein molded them into a professional act, and producer George Martin guided and developed their recordings, greatly expanding their domestic success after their first hit, Love Me Do, in late 1962. As their popularity grew into the intense fan frenzy dubbed Beatlemania, the band acquired the nickname the Fab Four, with Epstein, Martin and other members of the band's entourage sometimes given the informal title of Fifth Beatle. The Beatles were international stars by early 1964, leading the British invasion of the United States pop market and breaking numerous sales records. They soon made their film debut with A Hard Day's Night, 1964. From 1965 onwards, they produced increasingly innovative recordings, including the albums Rubber Soul, 1965, Revolver, 1966, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, and enjoyed further commercial success with the Beatles, also known as the White Album, 1968, and Abbey Road, 1969. In 1968, they founded Apple Corp., a multi-armed multimedia corporation that continues to oversee projects related to the band's legacy. After the group's breakup in 1970, all 4 members enjoyed success as solo artists. Lennon was shot and killed in December 1980, and Harrison died of lung cancer in November 2001. McCartney and Starr remain musically active. The Beatles are the best-selling band in history, with estimated sales of over 800 million albums worldwide. They are the best-selling music artists in the US, with certified sales of over 178 million units, and have had more #1 albums on the British charts, and have sold more singles in the UK, than any other act. The group were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, and all 4 main members were inducted individually between 1994 and 2015. In 2008, the group topped Billboard magazine's list of the all-time most successful artists. As of 2019, the Beatles hold the record for most #1 hits on the Hot 100 chart with 20. The band have received 7 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award, for Best Original Song Score for the 1970 film Let It Be, and 15 Ivor Novello Awards. They were also collectively included in Time magazine's compilation of the 20th century's 100 most influential people. History: 1957 to 1962, formation, Hamburg, and UK popularity. In March 1957, John Lennon, then aged 16, formed a skiffle group with several friends from Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool. They briefly called themselves the Blackjacks, before changing their name to the Quarrymen after discovering that a respected local group was already using the other name. 15-year-old Paul McCartney joined them as a rhythm guitarist shortly after he and Lennon met that July. In February 1958, McCartney invited his friend George Harrison to watch the band. The 15-year-old auditioned for Lennon, impressing him with his playing, but Lennon initially thought Harrison was too young for the band. After a month of Harrison's persistence, during a second meeting, arranged by McCartney, he performed the lead guitar part of the instrumental song Raunchy on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, and they enlisted him as their lead guitarist. By January 1959, Lennon's Corey Bank friends had left the group, and he began his studies at the Liverpool College of Art. The three guitarists, billing themselves at least 3 times as Johnny and the Moondogs, were playing rock and roll whenever they could find a drummer. Lennon's art school friend Stuart Sutcliffe, who had just sold one of his paintings and was persuaded to purchase a bass guitar, joined in January 1960, and it was he who suggested changing the band's name to Beatles, as a tribute to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They used this name until May, when they became the Silver Beatles, before undertaking a brief tour of Scotland as the backing group for pop singer and fellow Liverpudlian Johnny Gentle. By early July, they had refashioned themselves as the Silver Beatles, and by the middle of August shortened the name to the Beatles. Alan Williams, the Beatles' unofficial manager, arranged a residency for them in Hamburg, but lacking a full-time drummer they auditioned and hired Pete Best in mid-August 1960. The band, now a 5-piece, left 4 days later, contracted to club owner Bruno Kosmider for what would be a 31/2-month residency. Beatles historian Mark Lewison writes, "They pulled into Hamburg at dusk on 17th of August, the time when the red light area comes to life. Flashing neon lights screamed out the various entertainment on offer, while scantily clad women sat unabashed in shop windows waiting for business opportunities." Kosmider had converted a couple of strip clubs in the district into music venues, and he initially placed the Beatles at the Ender Club. After closing Ender due to noise complaints, he moved them to the Kaiserkeller in October. When he learned they had been performing at the rival Top 10 club in breach of their contract, he gave the band 1 month's termination notice, and reported the underage Harrison, who had obtained permission to stay in Hamburg by lying to the German authorities about his age. The authorities arranged for Harrison's deportation in late November. 1 week later, Kosmider had McCartney and Best arrested for arson after they set fire to a condom in a concrete corridor. The authorities deported them. Lennon returned to Liverpool in early December, while Sutcliffe remained in Hamburg until late February with his German fiancée Astrid Kirchherr, who took the first semi-professional photos of the Beatles. During the next 2 years, the Beatles were resident for periods in Hamburg, where they used Prelude both recreationally and to maintain their energy through all-night performances. In 1961, during their second Hamburg engagement, Kirchherr cut Sutcliffe's hair in the existentialist style, later adopted by the other Beatles. When Sutcliffe decided to leave the band early that year and resume his art studies in Germany, McCartney took up the bass. Producer Bert Kaempfert contracted what was now a 4-piece group until June 1962, and he used them as Tony Sheridan's backing band on a series of recordings for Polydor Records. As part of the sessions, the Beatles were signed to Polydor for 1 year. Credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, the single My Bonnie, recorded in June 1961 and released 4 months later, reached number 32 on the Music Mark chart. After the Beatles completed their second Hamburg residency, they enjoyed increasing popularity in Liverpool with a growing Merseybeat movement. However, they were also growing tired of the monotony of numerous appearances at the same clubs night after night. In November 1961, during one of the group's frequent performances at the Cavern Club, they encountered Brian Epstein, a local record store owner and music columnist. He later recalled, "I immediately liked what I heard. They were fresh, and they were honest, and they had what I thought was a sort of presence, star quality." Epstein courted the band over the next couple of months, and they appointed him as their manager in January 1962. Throughout early and mid-1962, Epstein sought to free the Beatles from their contractual obligations to Bert Kaempfert Productions. He eventually negotiated a 1-month early release from their contract in exchange for one last recording session in Hamburg. Tragedy greeted them on their return to Germany in April, when a distraught Kirchherr met them at the airport with news of Sutcliffe's death the previous day from what was later determined as a brain hemorrhage. Epstein began negotiations with record labels for a recording contract. In order to secure a UK record contract, Epstein negotiated an early end to the band's contract with Polydor, in exchange for more recordings backing Tony Sheridan. After a New Year's Day audition, Decca Records rejected the band with the comment guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. However, 3 months later, producer George Martin signed the Beatles to EMI's Parlophone label. Martin's first recording session with the Beatles took place at EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London on June 6, 1962. Martin immediately complained to Epstein about Best's poor drumming and suggested they use a session drummer in his place. Already contemplating Best's dismissal, the Beatles replaced him in mid-August with Ringo Starr, who left Dory Storm and the Hurricanes to join them. A 4th of September session at EMI yielded a recording of Love Me Do featuring Starr on drums, but a dissatisfied Martin hired drummer Randy White for the band's third session a week later, which produced recordings of Love Me Do, Please Please Me and P.S. I Love You. Martin initially selected the Starr version of Love Me Do for the band's first single, though subsequent repressings featured the White version, with Starr on tambourine. Released in early October, Love Me Do peaked at number 17 on the record retailer chart. Their television debut came later that month with a live performance on the regional news program People and Places. After Martin suggested re-recording Please Please Me at a faster tempo, a studio session in late November yielded that recording, of which Martin accurately predicted, "You've just made your first number one." In December 1962, the Beatles concluded their fifth and final Hamburg residency. By 1963, they had agreed that all 4 band members would contribute vocals to their albums, including Starr, despite his restricted vocal range, to validate his standing in the group. Lennon and McCartney had established a songwriting partnership, and as the band's success grew, their dominant collaboration limited Harrison's opportunities as a lead vocalist. Epstein, in an effort to maximize the Beatles' commercial potential, encouraged them to adopt a professional approach to performing. Lennon recalled him saying, "Look, if you really want to get in these bigger places, you're going to have to change, stop eating on stage, stop swearing, stop smoking." Lennon said, "We used to dress how we liked, on and off stage. He'd tell us that jeans were not particularly smart and could we possibly manage to wear proper trousers, but he didn't want us suddenly looking square. He'd let us have our own sense of individuality." 1963 to 1966, Beatlemania and touring years. Please Please Me and With the Beatles. On February 11, 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 songs during a single studio session for their debut LP, Please Please Me. The album was supplemented by the 4 tracks already released on their first 2 singles. Martin originally considered recording the Beatles' debut LP Live at the Cavern Club, but after deciding that the building's acoustics were inadequate, he elected to simulate a live album with minimal production in a single marathon session at Abbey Road. After the moderate success of Love Me Do, the single Please Please Me met with a more emphatic reception. Released in January 1963, 2 months ahead of the album of the same name, the song reached number 1 on every UK chart except Record Retailer, where it peaked at number 2. Recalling how the Beatles rushed to deliver a debut album, bashing out Please Please Me in a day, AllMusic's Stephen Thomas Erlewine comments, "Decades after its release, the album still sounds fresh, precisely because of its intense origins." Lennon said little thought went into composition at the time. He and McCartney were just writing songs a la Everly Brothers, a la Buddy Holly, pop songs with no more thought of them than that, to create a sound. And the words were almost irrelevant. Released in March 1963, the album initiated a run during which 11 of their 12 studio albums released in the United Kingdom through to 1970 reached number 1. The band's third single, From Me to You, came out in April and was also a chart-topping hit, starting an almost unbroken string of 17 British number 1 singles for the Beatles, including all but one of the 18 they released over the next 6 years. Issued in August, the band's fourth single, She Loves You, achieved the fastest sales of any record in the UK up to that time, selling 750,000 copies in under 4 weeks. It became their first single to sell 1 million copies, and remained the biggest selling record in the UK until 1978. Their commercial success brought increased media exposure, to which the Beatles responded with an irreverent and comical attitude that defied the expectations of pop musicians at the time, inspiring even more interest. The band toured the UK 3 times in the first half of the year, a 4-week tour that began in February, the Beatles' first nationwide, preceded 3-week tours in March and May to June. As their popularity spread, a frenzied adulation of the group took hold. Greeted with riotous enthusiasm by screaming fans, the press dubbed the phenomenon Beatlemania. Although not billed as tour leaders, the Beatles overshadowed American acts Tommy Roe and Chris Montez during the February engagements and assumed top billing by audience demand, something no British act had previously accomplished while touring with artists from the US. A similar situation arose during their May to June tour with Roy Orbison. In late October, the Beatles began a 5-day tour of Sweden, their first time abroad since the final Hamburg engagement of December 1962. On their return to the UK on 31st of October, several hundred screaming fans greeted them in heavy rain at Heathrow Airport. Around 50 to 100 journalists and photographers as well as representatives from the BBC also joined the airport reception, the first of more than 100 such events. The next day, the band began its 4th tour of Britain within 9 months, this one scheduled for 6 weeks. In mid-November, as Beatlemania intensified, police resorted to using high-pressure water hoses to control the crowd before a concert in Plymouth. Please Please Me maintained the top position on the record retailer chart for 30 weeks, only to be displaced by its follow-up, with the Beatles, which EMI released on 22nd of November to record advance orders of 270,000 copies. The LP topped 500,000 albums sold in 1 week. Recorded between July and October, with the Beatles made better use of studio production techniques than its predecessor. It held the top spot for 21 weeks with a chart life of 40 weeks. Earl Wine described the LP as a sequel of the highest order, one that betters the original. In a reversal of then standard practice, EMI released the album ahead of the impending single I Want to Hold Your Hand, with the song excluded to maximize the single's sales. The album caught the attention of music critic William Mann of The Times, who suggested that Lennon and McCartney were the outstanding English composers of 1963. The newspaper published a series of articles in which Mann offered detailed analyses of the music, lending it respectability. With the Beatles became the second album in UK chart history to sell 1 million copies, a figure previously reached only by the 1958 South Pacific soundtrack. When writing the sleeve notes for the album, the band's press officer, Tony Barrow, used the superlative the Fabulous Foursome, which the media widely adopted as the Fab Four. First visit to United States and British invasion. EMI's American subsidiary, Capitol Records, hindered the Beatles' releases in the United States for more than a year by initially declining to issue their music, including their first 3 singles. Concurrent negotiations with the independent U.S. label Vee-Jay led to the release of some of the songs in 1963, but not all. Vee-Jay finished preparation for the album introducing the Beatles, culled from most of the songs of Parlophone's Please Please Me, but a management shakeup led to the album not being released. Then when it surfaced that the label did not report royalties on their sales, the license Vee-Jay signed with EMI was voided. A new license was granted to the Swan label for the single She Loves You. The record received some airplay in the Tidewater area of Virginia by Gene Loving of radio station WGH and was featured on the Rated Records segment of American Bandstand, but it failed to catch on nationally. Epstein arranged for a $40,000 U.S. marketing campaign. American chart success began after disc jockey Carol James of AM radio station WWDC, in Washington, D.C., obtained a copy of the British single I Want to Hold Your Hand in mid-December 1963 and began playing it on air. Taped copies of the song soon circulated among other radio stations throughout the U.S. This caused an increase in demand, leading Capitol to bring forward the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand by 3 weeks. Issued on 26th of December, with the band's previously scheduled debut then just weeks away, I Want to Hold Your Hand sold 1 million copies, becoming a #1 hit in the US by mid-January. In its wake, Vee-Jay released Introducing the Beatles to go along with Capitol's debut album, Meet the Beatles, while Swan reactivated production of She Loves You. On February 7, 1964, the Beatles left the United Kingdom with an estimated 4,000 fans gathered at Heathrow, waving and screaming as the aircraft took off. Upon landing at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, an uproarious crowd estimated at 3,000 greeted them. They gave their first live U.S. television performance 2 days later on The Ed Sullivan Show, watched by approximately 73 million viewers in over 23 million households, or 34% of the American population. Biographer Jonathan Gould writes that, according to the Nielsen ratings service, it was the largest audience that had ever been recorded for an American television program. The next morning, the Beatles awoke to a largely negative critical consensus in the U.S., but a day later at their first U.S. concert, Beatlemania erupted at the Washington Coliseum. Back in New York the following day, the Beatles met with another strong reception during 2 shows at Carnegie Hall. The band flew to Florida, where they appeared on the weekly Ed Sullivan Show a second time, before another 70 million viewers, before returning to the UK on 22nd of February. The Beatles' first visit to the United States took place when the nation was still mourning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy the previous November. Commentators often suggest that, for many, particularly the young, the Beatles' performances reignited the sense of excitement and possibility that momentarily faded in the wake of the assassination, and helped make way for the revolutionary social changes to come in the decade. Their hairstyle, unusually long for the era and mocked by many adults, became an emblem of rebellion to the burgeoning youth culture. The group's popularity generated unprecedented interest in British music, and a number of other UK acts subsequently made their own American debuts, successfully touring over the next 3 years in what was termed the British Invasion. The Beatles' success in the US opened the door for a successive string of British beat groups and pop acts such as the Dave Clark Five, The Animals, Petula Clark, The Kinks, and the Rolling Stones to achieve success in America. During the week of April 4, 1964, the Beatles held 12 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 Singles chart, including the top 5. A Hard Day's Night. Capitol Records' lack of interest throughout 1963 did not go unnoticed, and a competitor, United Artists Records, encouraged their film division to offer the Beatles a 3-motion picture deal, primarily for the commercial potential of the soundtracks in the U.S. Directed by Richard Lester, A Hard Day's Night involved the band for 6 weeks in March to April 1964 as they played themselves in a musical comedy. The film premiered in London and New York in July and August, respectively, and was an international success, with some critics drawing comparison with the Marx Brothers. United Artists released a full soundtrack album for the North American market, combining Beatles songs and Martin's orchestral score. Elsewhere, the group's third studio LP, A Hard Day's Night, contained songs from the film on Side 1 and other new recordings on Side 2. According to Earl Wine, the album saw them truly coming into their own as a band. All of the disparate influences on their first 2 albums coalesced into a bright, joyous, original sound, filled with ringing guitars and irresistible melodies. That ringing guitar sound was primarily the product of Harrison's 12-string electric Rickenbacker, a prototype given to him by the manufacturer, which made its debut on the record. 1964 World Tour, meeting Bob Dylan, and Stand on Civil Rights. Touring internationally in June and July, the Beatles staged 37 shows over 27 days in Denmark, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, Australia, and New Zealand. In August and September they returned to the US, with a 30-concert tour of 23 cities. Generating intense interest once again, the month-long tour attracted between 10,000 and 20,000 fans to each 30-minute performance in cities from San Francisco to New York. In August, journalist Al Aronowitz arranged for the Beatles to meet Bob Dylan. Visiting the band in their New York hotel suite, Dylan introduced them to Cannabis. Gould points out the musical and cultural significance of this meeting, before which the musicians' respective fonduses were perceived as inhabiting 2 separate subcultural worlds. Dylan's audience of college kids with artistic or intellectual leanings, a dawning political and social idealism, and a mildly bohemian style contrasted with their fans, veritable teeny boppers - kids in high school or grade school whose lives were totally wrapped up in the commercialized popular culture of television, radio, pop records, fan magazines, and teen fashion. To many of Dylan's followers in the folk music scene, the Beatles were seen as idolaters, not idealists. Within 6 months of the meeting, according to Gould, Lennon would be making records on which he openly imitated Dylan's nasal drone, brittle strum, and introspective vocal persona, and 6 months after that, Dylan began performing with the backing band and electric instrumentation, and dressed in the height of mod fashion. As a result, Gould continues, the traditional division between folk and rock enthusiasts nearly evaporated, as the Beatles fans began to mature in their outlook and Dylan's audience embraced the new, youth-driven pop culture. During the 1964 U.S. tour, the group were confronted with the reality of racial segregation in the country at the time, particularly in the South. When informed that the venue for their 11th of September concert, the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida, was segregated, the Beatles said they would refuse to perform unless the audience was integrated. Lennon stated, "We never play to segregated audiences and we aren't going to start now. I'd sooner lose our appearance money." City officials relented and agreed to allow an integrated show. The group also canceled their reservations at the whites-only Hotel George Washington in Jacksonville. Documents reveal that for their subsequent U.S. tours in 1965 and 1966, the Beatles included clauses in contracts stipulating that shows be integrated. Beatles for Sale, Help! And Rubber Soul. According to Gould, Beatles for Sale, the Beatles' fourth studio LP, evidenced a growing conflict between the commercial pressures of their global success and their creative ambitions. They had intended the album, recorded between August and October 1964, to continue the format established by A Hard Day's Night, which, unlike their first two LPs, contained only original songs. They had nearly exhausted their backlog of songs on the previous album, however, and given the challenges constant international touring posed to their songwriting efforts, Lennon admitted, material's becoming a hell of a problem. As a result, 6 covers from their extensive repertoire were chosen to complete the album. Released in early December, its 8 original compositions stood out, demonstrating the growing maturity of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. In early 1965, following a dinner with Lennon, Harrison and their wives, Harrison's dentist John Riley secretly added LSD to their coffee. Lennon described the experience, "It was just terrifying, but it was fantastic. I was pretty stunned for a month or two." He and Harrison subsequently became regular users of the drug, joined by Starr on at least one occasion. Harrison's use of psychedelic drugs encouraged his path to meditation and Hinduism. He commented, "For me, it was like a flash. The first time I had acid, it just opened up something in my head that was inside of me, and I realized a lot of things. I didn't learn them because I already knew them, but that happened to be the key that opened the door to reveal them. From the moment I had that, I wanted to have it all the time." These thoughts about the yogis and the Himalayas, and Ravi's music. McCartney was initially reluctant to try it, but eventually did so in late 1966. He became the first Beatle to discuss LSD publicly, declaring in a magazine interview that it opened my eyes and made me a better, more honest, more tolerant member of society. Controversy erupted in June 1965 when Queen Elizabeth II appointed all 4 Beatles members of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, after Prime Minister Harold Wilson nominated them for the award. In protest, the honor was at that time primarily bestowed upon military veterans and civic leaders. Some conservative MBE recipients returned their own insignia. Released in July, the Beatles' second film, Help, was again directed by Lester. Described as mainly a relentless spoof of Bond, it inspired a mixed response among both reviewers and the band. McCartney said, "Help was great, but it wasn't our film, we were sort of guest stars. It was fun, but basically, as an idea for a film, it was a bit wrong." The soundtrack was dominated by Lennon, who wrote and sang lead on most of its songs, including the 2 singles, Help and Ticket to Ride. The accompanying Help Album, the group's fifth studio LP, mirrored A Hard Day's Night by featuring soundtrack songs on side 1 and additional songs from the same sessions on side 2. The LP contained all original material save for 2 covers, Act Nationally and Dizzy Miss Lizzie. They were the last covers the band would include on an album, with the exception of Let It Be's brief rendition of the traditional Liverpool folk song Maggie May. The band expanded their use of vocal overdubs on Help, and incorporated classical instruments into some arrangements, including a string quartet on the pop ballad Yesterday. Composed by and sung by McCartney, none of the other Beatles perform on the recording. Yesterday inspired the most cover versions of any song ever written. The group's third U.S. tour opened with a performance before a world record crowd of 55,600 at New York's Shea Stadium on August 15, 1965, perhaps the most famous of all Beatles concerts, in Louisanne's description. A further 9 successful concerts followed in other American cities. At a show in Atlanta, the Beatles gave one of the first live performances ever to make use of a fold-back system of on-stage monitor speakers. Towards the end of the tour, they met with Elvis Presley, a foundational musical influence on the band, who invited them to his home in Beverly Hills. September saw the launch of an American Saturday morning cartoon series, The Beatles, that echoed A Hard Day's Night's slapstick antics over its 2-year original run. The series was a historical milestone as the first weekly television series to feature animated versions of real, living people. In mid-October 1965, the Beatles entered the recording studio. For the first time when making an album, they had an extended period without other major commitments. Until this time, according to George Martin, we had been making albums rather like a collection of singles. Now we were really beginning to think about albums as a bit of art on their own. Released in December, Rubber Soul was hailed by critics as a major step forward in the maturity and complexity of the band's music. Their thematic reach was beginning to expand as they embraced deeper aspects of romance and philosophy. Biographers Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines attribute the new musical direction to the Beatles' now habitual use of marijuana, an assertion confirmed by the band. Lennon referred to it as the pot album, and Starr said, "Grass was really influential in a lot of our changes, especially with the writers. And because they were writing different material, we were playing differently." After Help's foray into the world of classical music with flutes and strings, Harrison's introduction of a sitar on Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, marked a further progression outside the traditional boundaries of popular music. As their lyrics grew more artful, fans began to study them for deeper meaning. Of Norwegian Wood, Lennon commented, "I was trying to be sophisticated in writing about an affair, but in such a smokescreen way that you couldn't tell." While many of Rubber Soul's prominent songs were the product of Lennon and McCartney's collaborative songwriting, it also featured distinct compositions from each, though they continued to share official credit. The song In My Life, of which each later claimed lead authorship, is considered a highlight of the entire Lennon-McCartney catalog. Harrison called Rubber Soul his favorite album and Starr referred to it as the departure record. McCartney has said, "We'd had our cute period, and now it was time to expand." However, recording engineer Norman Smith later stated that the studio sessions revealed signs of growing conflict within the group. "The clash between John and Paul was becoming obvious," he wrote, "and as far as Paul was concerned, George did no right." In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked Rubber Soul 5th among the 500 greatest albums of all time, and AllMusic's Richie Unterberger describes it as one of the classic folk rock records. Controversy, Final Tour and Revolver. Capitol Records, from December 1963 when it began issuing Beatles recordings for the U.S. market, exercised complete control over format, compiling distinct U.S. albums from the band's recordings and issuing songs of their choosing as singles. In June 1966, Yesterday and Today, one of Capitol's compilation albums, caused an uproar with its cover, which portrayed the grinning Beatles dressed in butcher's overalls, accompanied by raw meat and mutilated plastic baby dolls. It has been incorrectly suggested that this was meant as a satirical response to the way Capitol had butchered the U.S. versions of their albums. Thousands of copies of the LP had a new cover pasted over the original, An unpeeled first state copy fetched $10,500 at a December 2005 auction. In England, meanwhile, Harrison met sitar maestro Ravi Shankar, who agreed to train him on the instrument. During a tour of the Philippines the month after the Yesterday and Today furor, the Beatles unintentionally snubbed the nation's First Lady, Imelda Marcos, who had expected them to attend a breakfast reception at the presidential palace. When presented with the invitation, Epstein politely declined on the band members' behalf, as it had never been his policy to accept such official invitations. They soon found that the Marcos regime was unaccustomed to taking no for an answer. The resulting riots endangered the group and they escaped the country with difficulty. Immediately afterwards, the band members visited India for the first time. Almost as soon as they returned home, the Beatles faced a fierce backlash from U.S. religious and social conservatives, as well as the Ku Klux Klan, over a comment Lennon had made in a March interview with British reporter Maureen Cleave. "Christianity will go," Lennon had said. "It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that, I'm right and I will be proved right. Jesus was alright but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." The comment went virtually unnoticed in England, but when US teenage fan magazine Datebook printed it 5 months later, on the eve of the group's August US tour, it sparked a controversy with Christians in the American Bible Belt. The Vatican issued a protest, and bans on Beatles records were imposed by Spanish and Dutch stations and South Africa's national broadcasting service. Epstein accused Datebook of having taken Lennon's words out of context. At a press conference Lennon pointed out, "If I'd said television was more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it." Lennon claimed that he was referring to how other people viewed their success, but at the prompting of reporters, he concluded, "If you want me to apologize, if that will make you happy, then okay, I'm sorry." As preparations were made for the US tour, the Beatles knew that their music would hardly be heard. Having originally used Vox AC30 amplifiers, they later acquired more powerful 100-watt amplifiers, specially designed by Vox for them as they moved into larger venues in 1964, but these were still inadequate. Struggling to compete with the volume of sound generated by screaming fans, the band had grown increasingly bored with the routine of performing live. Recognizing that their shows were no longer about the music, they decided to make the August tour their last. Rubber Soul had marked a major step forward. Revolver, released in August 1966 a week before the Beatles' final tour, marked another. Pitchfork's Scott Plagenhoef identifies it as the sound of a band growing into supreme confidence and redefining what was expected from popular music. Revolver featured sophisticated songwriting, studio experimentation, and a greatly expanded repertoire of musical styles, ranging from innovative classical string arrangements to psychedelic rock. Abandoning the customary group photograph, its cover, designed by Klaus Verman, a friend of the band since their Hamburg days, was a stark, arty, black and white collage that caricatured the Beatles in a pen and ink style beholden to Aubrey Beardsley, in Gould's description. The album was preceded by the single paperback Rider, backed by Rain. Short promotional films were made for both songs, described by cultural historian Saul Austerlitz as among the first true music videos. They aired on The Ed Sullivan Show and Top of the Pops in June 1966. Among the experimental songs that Revolver featured was Tomorrow Never Knows, the lyrics for which Lennon drew from Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Its creation involved 8 tape decks distributed about the EMI building, each staffed by an engineer or band member, who randomly varied the movement of a tape loop while Martin created a composite recording by sampling the incoming data. McCartney's Eleanor Rigby made prominent use of a string octet. Gould describes it as a true hybrid, conforming to no recognizable style or genre of song. Harrison was developing as a songwriter, and 3 of his compositions earned a place on the record. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked Revolver as the 3rd greatest album of all time. During the US tour that followed its release, however, the band performed none of its songs. As Chris Ingham writes, they were very much studio creations, and there was no way a 4-piece rock and roll group could do them justice, particularly through the desensitizing wall of the fans' screams. Live Beatles and Studio Beatles had become entirely different beasts. The band's concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park on 29th of August was their last commercial concert. It marked the end of a 4-year period dominated by almost non-stop touring that included over 1,400 concert appearances internationally. 1966 to 1970, studio years. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Freed from the burden of touring, the Beatles embraced an increasingly experimental approach as they recorded Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, beginning in late November 1966. According to engineer Jeff Emmerich, the album's recording took over 700 hours. He recalled the band's insistence that everything on Sgt. Pepper had to be different. We had microphones right down in the bells of brass instruments and headphones turned into microphones attached to violins. We used giant primitive oscillators to vary the speed of instruments and vocals, and we had tapes chopped to pieces and stuck together upside down and the wrong way around. Parts of A Day in the Life featured a 40-piece orchestra. The sessions initially yielded the non-album double-A side single Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane in February 1967, the Sgt. Pepper LP followed in June. The musical complexity of the records, created using relatively primitive 4-track recording technology, astounded contemporary artists. Among music critics, acclaim for the album was virtually universal. Gould writes, "The overwhelming consensus is that the Beatles had created a popular masterpiece, a rich, sustained, and overflowing work of collaborative genius whose bold ambition and startling originality dramatically enlarged the possibilities and raised the expectations of what the experience of listening to popular music on record could be." On the basis of this perception, Sgt. Pepper became the catalyst for an explosion of mass enthusiasm for album-formatted rock that would revolutionize both the aesthetics and the economics of the record business in ways that far outstripped the earlier pop explosions triggered by the Elvis phenomenon of 1956 and the Beatlemania phenomenon of 1963. Sgt. Pepper was the first major pop, rock LP to include its complete lyrics, which appeared on the back cover. Those lyrics were the subject of critical analysis. For instance, in late 1967 the album was the subject of a scholarly inquiry by American literary critic and professor of English Richard Poirier, who observed that his students were listening to the group's music with a degree of engagement that he, as a teacher of literature, could only envy. Poirier identified what he termed its mixed elusiveness. It's unwise ever to assume that they're doing only one thing or expressing themselves in only one style. One kind of feeling about a subject isn't enough. Any single induced feeling must often exist within the context of seemingly contradictory alternatives. McCartney said at the time, "We write songs. We know what we mean by them. But in a week someone else says something about it, and you can't deny it. You put your own meaning at your own level to our songs." The album's elaborate cover also attracted considerable interest and study. A collage designed by pop artists Peter Blake and Jan Howarth, it depicted the group as the fictional band referred to in the album's title track standing in front of a crowd of famous people. The heavy mustaches worn by the group reflected the growing influence of hippie style, while cultural historian Jonathan Harris describes their brightly colored parodies of military uniforms as a knowingly anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment display. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it number 1 on its list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. On June 25, 1967, the Beatles performed their forthcoming single, All You Need Is Love, to an estimated 350 million viewers on Our World, the first live global television link. Released a week later, during the Summer of Love, the song was adopted as a flower power anthem. 2 months later, the group suffered a loss that threw their career into turmoil. Having been introduced to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi only the previous night in London, on 25th of August they traveled to Bangor for his transcendental meditation retreat. 2 days later, their manager's assistant, Peter Brown, phoned to inform them that Epstein, only 32 years old, had died. The coroner ruled the death an accidental carbatyl overdose, although it was widely rumored to be a suicide. Epstein had been in a fragile emotional state, stressed by personal troubles. His death left the group disoriented and fearful about the future. Lennon recalled, "We collapsed. I knew that we were in trouble then. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music, and I was scared. I thought, we've had it now." Magical Mystery Tour, The White Album and Yellow Submarine. Magical Mystery Tour, the soundtrack to a forthcoming Beatles television film, was released in the UK as a 6-track double extended play disc, EP, in early December 1967. In the United States, the 6 songs were issued on an identically titled LP that also included 5 tracks from the band's recent singles. Unterberger says of the US Magical Mystery Tour, "The psychedelic sound is very much in the vein of Sgt. Pepper, and even spacier in parts, especially the sound collages of I Am the Walrus," and he calls its 5 songs culled from the band's 1967 singles huge, glorious, and innovative. In its first 3 weeks, the album set a record for the highest initial sales of any Capitol LP, and it is the only Capitol compilation later to be adopted in the band's official canon of studio albums. First aired on Boxing Day, the Magical Mystery Tour film, largely directed by McCartney, brought the group their first major negative UK press. It was dismissed as blatant rubbish by the Daily Express, the Daily Mail called it a colossal conceit, and The Guardian labeled the film a kind of fantasy morality play about the grossness and warmth and stupidity of the audience. Gould describes it as a great deal of raw footage showing a group of people getting on, getting off, and riding on a bus. Although the viewership figures were respectable, its slating in the press led US television networks to lose interest in broadcasting the film. In January 1968, the Beatles filmed a cameo for the animated movie Yellow Submarine, which featured cartoon versions of the band members and a soundtrack with 11 of their songs, including 4 unreleased studio recordings that made their debut in the film. Released in June 1968, the film was praised by critics for its music, humor and innovative visual style. It would be 7 months, however, before its soundtrack album appeared. In the interim came the Beatles, a double LP commonly known as the White Album for its virtually featureless cover. Creative inspiration for the album came from a new direction. Without Epstein's guiding presence, the group had briefly turned to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi as their guru. At his ashram in Rishikesh, India, a guide course scheduled for 3 months marked one of their most prolific periods, yielding numerous songs including a majority of the 30 included on the album. However, Starr left after only 10 days, likening it to Butlins, and McCartney eventually grew bored and departed a month later. For Lennon and Harrison, creativity turned to questioning when an electronics technician known as Magic Alex suggested that the Maharishi was attempting to manipulate them. When he alleged that the Maharishi had made sexual advances to women attendees, a persuaded Lennon left abruptly just 2 months into the course, bringing an unconvinced Harrison and the remainder of the group's entourage with him. In anger, Lennon wrote a scathing song titled Maharishi, renamed Sexy Sadie to avoid potential legal issues. McCartney said, "We made a mistake. We thought there was more to him than there was." During recording sessions for the White Album, which stretched from late May to mid-October 1968, relations between the Beatles grew openly divisive. Starr quit for 2 weeks, and McCartney took over the drum kit for Back in the USSR, on which Harrison and Lennon drummed as well, and Dear Prudence. Lennon had lost interest in collaborating with McCartney, whose contribution Obladi he scorned as granny music shit. Tensions were further aggravated by Lennon's romantic preoccupation with avant-garde artist Yoko Ono, whom he insisted on bringing to the sessions despite the group's well-established understanding that girlfriends were not allowed in the studio. Describing the double album, Lennon later said, "Every track is an individual track, there isn't any Beatle music on it. It's John and the band, Paul and the band, George and the band." McCartney has recalled that the album wasn't a pleasant one to make. Both he and Lennon identified the sessions as the start of the band's breakup. Issued in November, the White Album was the band's first Apple Records album release, although EMI continued to own their recordings. The new label was a subsidiary of Apple Corp., which Epstein had formed as part of his plan to create a tax-effective business structure. The record attracted more than 2 million advance orders, selling nearly 4 million copies in the US in little over a month, and its tracks dominated the playlists of American radio stations. Despite its popularity, it did not receive flattering reviews at the time. According to Gould, the critical response ranged from mixed to flat. In marked contrast to Sgt. Pepper, which had helped to establish an entire genre of literate rock criticism, the White Album inspired no critical writing of any note. Even the most sympathetic reviewers clearly didn't know what to make of this shapeless outpouring of songs. Newsweek's Hubert Saul, citing the high proportion of parodies, accused the group of getting their tongues caught in their cheeks. General critical opinion eventually turned in favor of the White Album, and in 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it as the 10th greatest album of all time. Pitchfork's Mark Richardson describes it as large and sprawling, overflowing with ideas but also with indulgences, and filled with a hugely variable array of material. Its failings are as essential to its character as its triumphs. Erlewine comments, the band's two main songwriting forces were no longer on the same page, but neither were George and Ringo, yet Lennon turns in two of his best ballads. McCartney's songs are stunning. Harrison had become a songwriter who deserved wider exposure, and Starr's composition was a delight. The Yellow Submarine LP, issued in January 1969, contained only the 4 previously unreleased songs that had debuted in the film, along with the title track, already issued on Revolver, All You Need Is Love, already issued as a single and on the US Magical Mystery Tour LP, and 7 instrumental pieces composed by Martin. Because of the paucity of new Beatles music, AllMusic's Unterberger and Bruce Eder suggest the album might be inessential, but for Harrison's It's All Too Much, the jewel of the new songs, resplendent and swirling mellotron, sick, larger-than-life percussion, and tidal waves of feedback guitar, a virtuoso excursion into otherwise hazy psychedelia. Abbey Road, Let It Be and Separation. Although Let It Be was the Beatles' final album release, it was largely recorded before Abbey Road. The project's impetus came from an idea Martin attributes to McCartney, who suggested they record an album of new material and rehearse it, then perform it before a live audience for the very first time, on record and on film. Originally intended for a 1-hour television program to be called Beatles at Work, in the event much of the album's content came from studio work beginning in January 1969. Many hours of which were captured on film by director Michael Lindsay Hogg. Martin has said that the project was not at all a happy recording experience. It was a time when relations between the Beatles were at their lowest ebb. Lennon described the largely impromptu sessions as hell, the most miserable, on earth, and Harrison, the low of all time. Irritated by both McCartney and Lennon, Harrison walked out for 5 days. Upon returning, he threatened to leave the band unless they abandoned all talk of live performance and instead focused on finishing a new album, initially titled